All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. I hope everyone is having a terrific week here. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today in our discussion around CMMC, its compliance, and how to think maybe beyond that a little bit from the point of view of IT/OT security. Just by way of introduction, my name is John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial Protection. I spent my first 20-something years of my career with a firm called McKinsey & Company, helping clients, large industrial companies, work through digital transformations and that sort of thing. And then about 5 years ago, I joined Verve as the CEO due to the increasing challenges and risks of securing these digital transformations. And so we've been helping clients around the world make those digital transformations more secure and more robust. Verve itself has been in existence for 28 years now. Our team is composed of both IT and OT folks. We started our life as a control system integrator, so living in the world of OT or industrial control systems and designing those for both security and reliability. And then over the last 12 or 13 years, we've been developing and deploying our software platform along with those services to help bridge the gaps of security and digital transformation in industrial environments. Verve itself helps clients and achieve impact from a security and reliability point of view by bringing three components together. And this really informs our discussion today around how to achieve this IT/OT security maturity. First is our software platform. It is a specific platform to enable an integration across IT and OT for ensuring cybersecurity and reliability of those operating industrial systems. We then have a range of design for what we call design for defense services. So this is things like assessments and security implementations like network segmentation, et cetera, that help improve the maturity of clients. And then also we provide a range of managed services that help maintain that security posture over time. And so from these different lenses, I'll call it, we draw a lot of experiences around how to make effective security happen where we're bridging the IT and the OT realm. And obviously one of the big places that this happens is in the manufacturing landscape and specifically within the defense industrial base where CMMC is specifically focused. So let's begin with our discussion today. As the title suggested, we're going to focus our discussion around CMMC, or also referred to as the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. But we're also going to talk about beyond CMMC and how to think about securing your control systems, not just for CMMC, but more holistically. So what is CMMC? It is a US Department of Defense, new-ish, I say, because they've been working on it for quite a while, cybersecurity standard for the defense industrial base. It is specifically focused around DoD contracts, and it will be implemented over time, and it will apply to any contractor at any tier doing business with the DoD. So if you're a supplier to a supplier to a supplier of an eventual customer that's then supplying the DoD, there may or will be requirements, there will be requirements. They will depend on the type of information that you are accessing, but you will have some level of requirements. Each contract will define the security maturity levels required for that scope of work. The vendors will be assessed against 5 essentially maturity levels, and we'll talk about those, by a group called the accreditation body. The accreditation body is just being formed. There is now a CEO of the accreditation body and a chairman, and that group is being formed as we speak, literally. CMMC focuses on the protection of CUI, or controlled unclassified information. CMMC, again, is focused on information protection. The main focus of this effort historically has been a focus on protecting the nation's defense secrets, as it were, from disclosure to foreign governments or hackers who potentially might sell those secrets on the open market. The most obvious example of this was the F-35 program. So it is focused, again, in a way narrowly on that CUI. So it's not focused on a broader cybersecurity posture. And so therefore there's a series of ways of limiting the required scope for CMMC compliance by limiting where that CUI is and goes. And then timing. When does this happen? Well, it starts this year with several pilot programs, and it is expected to have full implementation by 2025, although frankly, there's been some delay in that. COVID has created some complexity. Also, the change of administrations has created a little bit of delay. It's unclear whether it will be certain 2025 or beyond. But over this period of time, more and more contracts will be awarded using a CMC standard and requiring a set of security requirements based on the CMC standard. Sorry, turn the page here. So what is CMC? How is it structured, et cetera? There are lots of articles online that one could look at and go through, and there's very long documents from the DoD about how this works. But trying to simplify this down, you have the model overall. That is broken down into multiple quote unquote domains. Those domains are different categories, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So access control or asset management. And then within those, there are a set of processes and practices along a maturity curve that companies would have to achieve to be considered a level 1 maturity or a level 2 maturity. And so there's processes, things that you need to do from a procedural point of view. And then there are actual practices, and that often comes into technically doing things such as patching or ensuring least privilege access, that sort of thing. So there's these set of domains, and the process maturity or process institutionalization characterizes how far that organization is in their maturity journey. So what are these? What are these domains? So there are 17 quote unquote domains in version 1. For any of you who have looked at other cybersecurity standards, whether that be the Center for Internet Security, NIST 800, et cetera, these are not surprising, right? They are very, very similar domains to what we see in other standards. Lots of debate as to whether we needed another standard or not. Probably water under the bridge at this point. The reality is we have one. And the good news is that it's leveraging a lot of what other standards were already either requiring or encouraging. And those processes and practices, the way that CMMC refers to the maturity is the most basic level is either the processes are performed or the practices have basic cyber hygiene. And we're going to talk more about these specifics as we go today. Then you could be those processes, are documented. So they're not only performed, but they're documented. Okay, great, they're documented. Are they managed? In other words, are we monitoring that those processes are actually happening? Do we then review them on a regular basis to see if it still works or not? And then finally, do we adjust them over time so that they get better and better? On the practices front, as I mentioned, you've got basic, intermediate, good, and then we go into these two terms of proactive and advanced. Proactive just means that you are going beyond kind of the basic fundamentals, and you are thinking ahead of where an attacker may be. And then advanced and progressive are quite advanced levels of cybersecurity that our guess is that relatively few organizations will achieve that level 5 level of maturity. But this is the basic construct of what is in the CMMC model. So as we think about the levels, there are at level 1, there are about 17 practices. There are 17 practices that you need to achieve to be a level 1. And these are relatively basic. Like, do I know what assets are on my network? Do I know where my information is? That sort of thing. At level 2, there's another 72. And then at level 3, you get to a total of 130 practices. And many people have asked, okay, so what's the difference between this and the old DoD standard, which was referred to as DFARS in some cases, and was following a standard called NIST 800-171. And I'm not going to go through the the compliance bingo here or the NIST bingo card. But the reality is, if you were familiar with NIST 800-171, CMMC is essentially that plus about 10 additional controls. It essentially includes all of those 800-171 plus a few more. As you move out to level 4, and sorry, this chart is mislabeled, level 5, you get to adding more and more controls that are beyond 800-171 that start to encompass a broader group of the total NIST 800 requirements. So I don't mean to spend an inordinate amount of time on these different standards, but it is one of the challenges with CMMC is that a lot of people have spent a lot of time focused on NIST 800-171 DFARS, and that approach has led to some confusion about which is which, right? Is it different? Is it the same, et cetera? Sorry. So just as a way to break down a little bit of that different standards, you've got at the NIST level anyway, you've got 800, that then breaks down to 853, and that then breaks down into 882, which is really the ICS or OT security guidelines. And then there was what the DFARS, which is the DoD supply chain security guidelines, which are still in place, still there. And what CMMC does is add that maturity approach beyond that. And so, as I said, CMMC level 3, for instance, includes the NIST 800-171 plus several other controls. When you get to level 5, you've got those level 3 controls plus an additional 41 elements of maturity in that model. And that's basically broken down, as you can see on this page. So level 3 includes all those practices from 171 as well as some others. And level 4 and 5 are bringing in practices from 171B plus several others. And then CMMC has done a good job of bringing in information or guides and sources from other countries as well, UK, Australia, et cetera, to try and add richness to the overall maturity model itself. So that's the basic construct of what we're talking about with CMMC. If you would like more details on exactly all of those components, they're available. We're happy to share those with you ourselves. They're quite available from DoD, et cetera. But now we're going to step back a little bit to, okay, so why are we doing this? Why should we care? And the reality is that foreign actors have already demonstrated successful infiltration of the defense industrial base to steal some of this critical weapons intellectual property. And those supply chain risks are a critical source of vulnerabilities for the industrial companies as well. And they're at risk not only of targeted attempts to steal that information, which is the focus of CMMC, but manufacturing and industrial companies are becoming more and more open and targeted by ransomware. And that can cause significant operational disruption, which we'll talk about. While that's not the focus of CMMC today, it is clearly a gap and a need within the industrial, both the DoD industrial base, but broadly the world's manufacturing base. And so just as a very real world example of this, just yesterday, there was a news report of the Rockwell group, or Rockwell group, depending on how you want to pronounce that, announced their they issued a email and a tweet saying that they are essentially ransoming Apple. They attacked Apple's supplier Quanta, and they claim, and again, still figuring out all the fact from fiction here, but they claim to have both essentially locked up and then stolen critical proprietary Apple product information. Okay, now this is not a DIB or defense industrial based question, although Apple is certainly a provider to the DoD, but it is a particular issue for that vendor, i.e. Quanta, selling to that customer, Apple. And so they have essentially said, we have control of this data and it's proprietary. It's all essentially the future releases of Apple. And we're going to start releasing this unless we get paid $50 million. Now, we can all debate whether 50 million is the right number or the wrong number, and whether this is going to turn out to have as much information as the tweet pronounces. The reality is this is happening. This is not theory. This is not, something that might happen someday. This is front page of, sort of all the security press over the last couple of days. So it's something from a classified or a confidential information point of view that's relevant not just to the defense industrial base, but much more broadly than that. But the reality is that protection of CUI is only one of a range of risks that industrial companies face. So we think about this as three broad types of risks. The first being what we refer to as collateral damage. These are attacks that weren't necessarily focused on the OT side of a manufacturing company. In some cases, not even focused maybe at one manufacturing company at all, but where due to the spread of malware or ransomware in these cases, it impacts organizations that, and particularly parts of organizations, i.e. the OT part of the organizations, even without being targeted and planned. The second type is the insider threats, where somebody's either stealing data or alternatively causing disruptions. And then there's the more advanced outsider attacks. One can think of the F-15 attack, Stuxnet being a very prominent example of this, or the Trisis attack over in Saudi Arabia. These are where advanced, intelligent, planned attacks occurred on a specific organization, where either the intent was to steal data or potentially to do harm, physical harm, as in the case of the Trisis attack. At least that's what the presumption is what they were trying to do. The reality is, again, this isn't just about CUI, although CMMC is focused on that. Manufacturing companies need to be aware and thinking more broadly than just CMMC. Some of the questions that came in before this webinar asked these questions around, well, okay, is CMMC all I need to do? Do I need to think more broadly than that? Does it solve all my problems? And the reality is that CMMC can help in many, many ways address these other risks as well as the CUI risks. But again, it is primarily focused on the CUI. The reality is that manufacturing is under an increasing threat. So oftentimes we think, well, who wants to target manufacturing? They're all going after the banks, or they're all going after the retail companies because they've got the credit card data. But just over the last year, we saw this significant shift towards where the number of attacks focused on finance and insurance were still number one, but manufacturing became the second largest victim, so to speak, of cyber threats and attacks, with energy being number three and retail falling further down, and transportation falling even further down yet. Now, that doesn't mean that those industries aren't under threat and under attack. They certainly are. And there's some basic reasons for this, right? Why is retail under less threat? Well, not spending as much time in the stores given COVID. And so there's other places to look for threats. But the reality is, or our opportunity if you're a hacker, but manufacturing is becoming a much more significant focus of the hacking groups. Just one comment on this. We do an analysis every year of the ICS CERT alerts that come out. And between 2019 and 2020 was roughly a 50% increase in the number of CVEs or vulnerabilities found in ICS products that were released through the Industrial Control Systems CERT, which is the organization that releases those vulnerability alerts. There were about a 25 or 30% increase in the number of alerts, but about a 50% increase in vulnerabilities because each alert can include multiple vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are focused heavily on that manufacturing and energy and transportation categories. As I mentioned, the concerns here are not just about CUI, although again, that's very important and critical from a compliance point of view, but those manufacturing attacks can also cause significant financial harm in terms of downtime. And so these are just a few examples that have become public and well known about how many plant days were lost from these ransomware events that hit these manufacturers. 8 of those 9 attacks last year impact, and these are just the public ones where there was, press about them that you could discover and be publicly allowed to share. Most of them happened on multiple plants. They were between $100,000 and $10 million in terms of ransomware payouts, demands anyway. And over time, more and more, we're seeing these IAOT ransomwares, which will make this even more complicated. But this is global, right? As you can see, companies from around the world, and the number of days of lost manufacturing is quite significant. And just if we go back in time a little bit to some of those cases that we talked about earlier, the dollars get really big really quickly, right? So Merck was a $900 million event. Okay, granted, it's a very, very large company, but one malware attack, a significant one, essentially was $1 billion financial impact to that organization. Norsk Hydro in 2019, that was about $150 million impact. And they actually had really, really good incident response capabilities with robust backups, et cetera. And so, as we think about this anyway, we want to make sure communicating today that CMMC is a great maturity model focused on CUI. But as manufacturing organizations and industrial organizations, we need to take a step back and say, okay, that's one part of what I'm trying to defend against. I'm not just trying to defend the information. I'm also trying to defend my operations from a larger security risk. So some people have asked, if I'm thinking about this CUI versus operational risk, can I limit my compliance requirements of CMMC, since what that focuses on is the CUI part of this and that information part? Can I find ways to limit my compliance exposure for maturity by limiting access? And the answer to that is absolutely. There are ways to segment your networks, and we'll talk about that, where you can actually limit the scope of where CMMC would apply to be able to reduce the number of systems, frankly, where you need to achieve those levels of maturity. But obviously, with things like ransomware and other types of attacks, there's no way to say, well, as long as I have a firewall there, I don't have to worry about that stuff over there. That's not how the hackers work. We need to think more holistically when we go more broad. And obviously, the CMMC efforts, if you are in the defense industrial base and you do have a CMMC compliance requirement over the next 4 or 5 years that gets managed, it's not going to be the only set of security requirements you're going to have. You're going to have auditors auditing you on whatever maturity level you need to achieve, but then you're also going to have requirements from all of your customers. And they will have, while we'd love to say that they're going to match up perfectly, they're not. And they're going to have their own set of security requirements. And so one of the ways we think about this is, while we should pursue CMMC, no question, we'll have to do that if we're in the defense industrial base. We need to take a step back and say, what's our overall cybersecurity strategy? What are we trying to achieve? And what standards or maturity models are we going to pursue to be able to achieve what we aspire to achieve, whether that be CIS, NIST, et cetera. So as we then take a step back from specifically focusing on maturity model, the CMMC maturity model, to what we think of as standards of security, the SANS ICS group does a survey every year to say, what standards are you pursuing? Now, this was pre-CMMC, and again, it was focused on standards rather than maturity models. And so one could debate whether CMMC will fit in here when they do the 2021 version of this, but which they'll do, it should be in the next couple months, I would expect. But as you can see, the NIST cybersecurity framework is the #1 framework that industrial companies are using around protecting their control systems. The CIS or CSC 20 was the second highest in 2017. It dropped a little bit in 2019, and the ISO sort of 27000 series caught up. And then obviously IEC 62443 is a very helpful standard, and it really took a lot of traction in 2018, 2019, and I would expect that when we see the 2021 version of this, IEC 62443 will be gaining a number of quote unquote converts or adoptees as we go. From our point of view, the important part of this is not necessarily which one of these that you pick, and frankly, they all overlap to some extent. They're used for different reasons. We're not trying to say, well, if you do CSF, you shouldn't do 62443 or ISO 27000. That's not the point here. The point is just to say, what are the various ones that people are using? And when we think about this, we can overlay the various standards or frameworks on one another to try and see, okay, what are some of the fundamental components that we want to think about using? And so the right-hand side of this page just lays out the NIST CSF, NIST cybersecurity framework on the, overlays the CIS top 20 on that, so that we kind of get a sense of how the frameworks, at least those top 2 on this page, start to overlay one on another. And you could do the same thing, by the way, looking at the maturity requirements in CMMC to overlay that on the NIST framework. But again, the point here is to say, what framework can we think of that might be a holistic way of thinking about our security, rather than just narrowly trying to check a box on a certain maturity level for CMMC. By the way, if anybody has questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. We're going to try and come back to as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. Okay. So CMMC, NIST, all of these are not specifically OT or ICS or anything security, either maturity models or frameworks or standards. Now, within the NIST framework, you get down to 800, and then you get down to 853, et cetera. You do get down to some ICS specific standards, but the reality is these environments are different. And so as we think about what we're going to do and how we're going to apply security into OT or the control system side versus IT, we need to think about and understand those differences. First, the device types. For anyone who has had experience in the control system side, we know that they run older systems. They run original equipment manufacturer applications like RS Logix and other things. They're proprietary software in many cases, older OSs, they're embedded devices running firmware, so the software is different and how one protects that software is different. The infrastructure is often different, right? Mostly on-prem versus the IT world has kind of moved to the cloud. In many cases, the OT side of that line is not managed the same way that the IT systems are. A lack of Active Directory access, patching isn't done at least as frequently as in the IT side, if at all. Many cases, antivirus may or may not be deployed. If it is, it's often out of date, signatures are late, et cetera. And I could go down this list, but a fundamental difference between these environments. And as we think of being able to apply security into that OT environment requires a bit of an evolution, I'll call it, from the way we might approach it on the IT side. Now, importantly, CMMC specifically doesn't make a difference, doesn't separate IT and OT and say, okay, well, OT you do this or IT you do this. They're a set of maturity models or requirements that they're going to check to see whether you're progressing down that road. And they are general. They are processes for patching or processes for incident response. And then we as operators need to work through what that means for us on an OT side and what it means for us on an IT side. Importantly, as I said before, at least for CMMC compliance, we can protect or remove some of those systems, those OT systems, from compliance requirements by not storing CUI on those systems and not allowing those systems to talk to systems where CUI is stored. And so we can limit some of those requirements and maturity components by limiting that access between the two sides or between machines in terms of that CUI. But from an overall security point of view, from a ransomware protection, from a potential attack from cyber attacks that might turn into physical impacts, those, just because I have one level of separation between the two and no CUI, that doesn't necessarily stop an attacker from making those kinds of risks happen. So how do we think about this? So these are the 17 what are referred to as capability domains that we talked about before: access control, asset management, awareness, physical protection, ability to recover. And the way we think about this best is to try to put together an IT/OT security platform that can bring these pieces together and over time can mature, whether you're trying to mature on CMMC or you're trying to mature across another framework or just broadly in the security realm, where we can bring these capabilities together into one platform to be able to manage both IT and OT together into that platform, so that you're not having to manage 14 different things and trying to see, okay, how did I do on that one and how did I do on that? Instead, trying to bring the pieces together. And we're going to talk about how these components can work. And by the way, you could add additional gears into this as you add new functionality to your overall security management program. So our view is that security really requires what we refer to as a 360-degree view of that risk. And what we mean by that is starts with your inventory, starts with understanding what assets you have in that environment. I think one of the things that we find most often as we talk to manufacturing companies, particularly mid-sized manufacturing companies, is they don't have any tools, systems, et cetera, to discover what's in their environment, right? If I'm a small manufacturer, I can probably know what's out there. But when I get, 1,000 devices or 10,000 devices on multiple sites, that becomes really, really challenging. The second piece then is knowing what vulnerabilities exist on those devices. So do I have software vulnerabilities sitting somewhere in that environment that I'm not aware of and that are unpatched? Again, missing patches, right? Do I have a way of monitoring and managing those patches? Configurations become a key part of the security elements, whether it be for CMMC or any of these other maturity models or standards and compliance regimes even. User and account risk, and I can go around this, but basically the ability to bring that view together to see which are the biggest risks to those endpoints or those assets and those networks, and to be able to then prioritize those risks based on what you know about the broader set of assets. And then obviously the ability to take actions on those risks, right? The ability to actually remediate them and fix them. So one of the things that we often hear when we talk to customers, frankly, before about the DFARS standard, the 800-171 they were trying to achieve, or frankly, when we talk to customers who have no defense industrial base at all and they're focused on other industries, this challenge of, well, great, I now know what I have, my problems. How do I fix it? How do I take those actions? And it becomes this sort of battle of, okay, I got to get WSUS and load up, or I got to manually go around and patch things. I got to find some way to change configuration settings. And so one of the key pieces to us is to have a platform that actually allows you to take those actions and start to remediate those risks quickly in a more automated fashion than literally manually going around and doing that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we think about doing that as the session goes on. So to start with, how do you start thinking about protecting those network pieces? So the first thing we'll discover as we walk through is, okay, network protections, right? That's going to be one of the elements of access control. How do I reduce, how do I control access into the environment? One of those ways is with network controls. And so we can think about, starting with up in the, kind of at at 2 o'clock there, enforcing VLAN rules and firewall separation. As I mentioned, if I can start putting in firewalls between systems that have CUI and that don't, I can reduce from a maturity model point of view and compliance point of view, I can reduce. But also from an overall security point of view, I create barriers to malware spreading, to attackers who get into one part of the network being able to move laterally into another part of the network. One of the big things we see almost in every assessment that we do is dual home connectivity. As an example, I have a firewall in place, but somebody needs remote access into that. And instead of setting up a proper remote access system, somebody in the plant has just basically put in two dual NICs, two NICs into the server, and they're using that to essentially bridge this great firewall that I put in place. Something that needs to be remediated relatively early on in any journey. Secure and harden the endpoints. So whether those be HMIs or network gear, et cetera, but going in and ensuring that we don't have configuration settings on those devices that allow access in. And I could go through this system and we're going to share this out so people can see it. But basically a range of risk reduction measures we can do on the network side, either for, I'll refer to it as compliance limitations, such as VLANing or particularly firewalls in place to reduce where the CUI can move, or from a broader security point of view, reducing movement of threats across your organization. In that access control piece, so as we talked about, one of the first elements of the CMMC domains is access control. And by the way, that access control is also required in NIST and CIS, is to understand what accounts and users you have on your system. So again, when we go into particularly OT environments, which aren't typically connected into an Active Directory infrastructure, we find numbers and numbers of accounts, dozens of accounts with expired passwords, over 180 days. We've got, lots of inactive users, users that haven't been used for 180, 90, depending on what your definition of dormant is. These are sort of problems, risks waiting to happen, right? I could be perfectly patched on a system, but if I've got users, particularly admin users, that are dormant and haven't been managed or have aged passwords, I have big risks in the environment. Lots of administrator accounts that have system access and default access, many times with essentially default passwords running on those systems. So this access control piece is a great sort of early step in being able to secure your environment. Obviously, you need to get this data into that platform I talked about, but once it's in that platform through gathering asset information, et cetera, you can start to manage this access control. While it's not the first alphabetically, access control comes before asset management. We think about it, if I go back to this chart for a second, on the right-hand side, asset inventory really is the beginning of this journey, right? Asset management, because alphabetically it's second, comes second, but really that asset inventory is the central gear which allows the rest of your security program to take shape. And so as I go back here, one of the keys to this is having a deep, rich view of your asset inventory. Not just to things like IP addresses and MAC addresses and maybe the communication ports, et cetera, but all the way down to knowing 100% of your patches that have been deployed, all the user accounts, password ages, configuration data off of all of those devices. The ability to gather that depth allows you to start to manage those assets in a way that's both compliant from a CMMC point of view, but also secure from a broader cybersecurity perspective. When we think about this, there's a bunch of ways you can gather asset inventory. We're just going to talk about two of them today, two of the specific OT ways that start to automate that. The first is the agent and agentless inventory approach. This is the way Verve, our platform, does it. We're not here to talk about the platform as much as we are just to say this is one model, a very effective model, a model we chose to use, but it's not the only model to go and gather asset inventory. And the way this works is you put a software agent, a very small one, basically the size of a calculator app, essentially, on your Windows devices. And that gathers literally hundreds of pieces of data passively about that device and what's on it. It also gathers information about what other devices are on that subnet. So it gives you a nice inventory. You then can connect with an agentless device interface to all of those devices that don't enable an agent, right? So think of your networking gear, your PLCs, your the IO cards in your PLCs, controllers, et cetera, VFDs. And that agentless connection then pulls back key information from those devices, such as make, model, firmware, configuration settings, et cetera. And it allows you to get that rich, deep, as that prior page showed, view of all of the assets in your environment. And you don't have to deploy any hardware to do it. It's 100% software based, so it's relatively quick to deploy, low cost, because I'm not putting a bunch of hardware in the network. And it gives me that really deep visibility. The other way that OT asset discovery is possible is through what's referred to as spans or taps or network traffic. We can debate exactly how you want to phrase that term. And basically what that approach is to put collectors, which are these red boxes here, next to or near the switches in your network. And if your switches allow for spanning traffic, you can capture the traffic through the span port. Obviously, if those switches are older or not as robust in terms of size for the network, or potentially some of the industrial switches, you can't really use span ports. And so you have to do some form of a tap additional piece of hardware on there. And so what this approach does is it gathers that traffic from those networks and then does packet inspection. So in other words, it interprets what's on that traffic to figure out what's actually on the system. It tries to basically, it's like two people in a conversation on a phone call, and they basically come in and sit in the middle of the phone call and try and figure out who's at each end of the conversation in a sort of vernacular way of thinking about it. There are advantages, disadvantages of both of this approach. It is, you have hardware in the network, et cetera. However, there's no agents to deploy on your devices, and you're not communicating with any of the devices directly. You're just capturing traffic. Obviously, the view that you get is slightly limited because that's what you only get what's on the wire. But a couple of ways that you can think about starting to build that asset inventory within your environment. Then as we think about the next step in that platform approach is, okay, now we got to bring in things like configurations, because configurations are a way of determining what kind of access control and other types of security controls I have on these devices. And so this is an example of using the data that we get back from that agent and agentless approach to basically analyze the configurations on all of your devices against a set of standards, right? Compliance checks, basically. And we look at all of these compliance checks to see, is that device configured in a way that protects it from attack. So for instance, do we have an ability to deny logons after X number of failed logons? Is it set up to have a password setting that requires 14 characters or a password setting that it's not, you can't log on if you've if your password is less than is over 90 days old, et cetera, et cetera. And they can get much more complicated than that. But this compliance check allows you to see, am I configured in such a way that I've essentially reduced the risk to the devices, created least privileges, et cetera. Many of those required for the CMMC compliance, but also for broader security elements. One of the other key elements of both CMMC compliance as well as broader security is being able to know what's going on or detect events and then respond to those events. So it's the detect and response elements of the NIST framework or the incident response elements of the CMMC model. And that is about, okay, I need to bring in data from things like syslog and netflow, changes to the configurations, metrics on devices. So am I seeing spikes in power usage or CPU usage, log data, et cetera. Bring that in and then be able to do analysis on that data, whether that be quote unquote threat hunting. And by the way, when you get to the right-hand side here, right, that becomes level 3, 4, or 5 from the standpoint of a CMMC maturity. But from an overall cybersecurity maturity, in terms of NIST or CIS or whatever, we want to be able to enable those elements so we can discover threats as they occur in the environment. Again, the platform concept here is really helpful because all of that data is coming into one place and I can see those actions, I can see these threats that are emerging, the changes that are emerging, and I can tie that back to the other endpoint information I have to develop compliance reports easily. So that's a big advantage of it. But also from an overall security point of view, I can root cause and respond to problems in a more rapid fashion, what's referred to as speed, mean time to detection and response. Now, obviously, as we think about asset management and the rest, there's the vulnerability management component of this, which includes the patching. So being able to prioritize which CVE families that I really want to focus on, which are the biggest risks in that environment. And then importantly, when you go into an OT environment, you may have tens of thousands of vulnerabilities. The ability to prioritize those vulnerabilities we may not be able to patch that system right away. Okay, well, first of all, is it a critical vulnerability on the right-hand side of this chart? Then do I have other compensating controls in place, like application whitelisting? Do I have a backup for that system, et cetera? Enables us to prioritize which of those vulnerabilities is most critical to remediate. Now, again, from a compliance point of view, in some ways, there's not a lot of caring about, well, is it, do you have application whitelisting or not, right? They want to get you patched. But from a security point of view, we need to think more broadly about, okay, how do I really deal with this issue within an OT environment? Because sometimes I'm not going to be able to achieve those patching type requirements in that environment. And so how do we manage all of these tasks, whether that be compliance tasks, like for CMMC and the compliance reporting, et cetera, or more broadly securing myself against ransomware or targeted attacks? Our view is coming up with using that platform approach, bringing these pieces together. Secondly, being able to what we call close the loop. So not only being able to see that there's an issue, but automating or providing automation, I guess I'd say, to the plant operators or the IT team to be able to actually remediate that vulnerability or risk. Integrating IT and OT security with those IT-like capabilities. There's, from a CMMC point of view, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of differentiation between IT and OT, right? And so being able to bring those two worlds together by applying IT-like capabilities in OT is very important. What we call think global, act local. So the ability to see holistically across your environment all of the potential vulnerabilities, network misconfigurations, access control issues, et cetera. But then when those actions happen, ensuring folks in the plant have the local control before those remediation actions happen is key to being able to do this in an IT and OT environment. And then obviously low cost, right? The less additional hardware I need to put in, the less manpower that's going to take to put in the solution or then manage the solution. All of those things have to be taken into account when we think about managing the complexity of all this. And so this kind of a platform approach does a few things. Number one, it gives you a much quicker time to getting that deep visibility into your assets, which is you can't do the compliance at CMMC or frankly be secure until you get that. And this kind of a platform approach with that deep visibility allows that. Number two, it becomes safe and effective across your IT OT world, right? It's IT solutions, but as I showed on that inventory chart, for instance, safe for operations in the OT world. It's a lower total cost of ownership because it centralizes that analysis, as I mentioned. We get that 360-degree view. So not only does that give me much easier and more comprehensive compliance reporting, but it also allows me to make better risk management trade-offs of what security control is best for that particular risk. And then finally, it speeds the response and the remediation. So, and I'm going to sort of end our discussion there. I've got about 5 minutes or so, and there's a series of questions up there. So I want to make sure I save some time for questions. There were a number of questions that came in before the event, and I want to touch on a couple of those, and then I'm going to get to the questions in the Q&A here. So first of all, why is CMMC better than adherence to NIST 853? I don't think this is a better or worse discussion. They're different. CMMC is a maturity model rather than a standard per se, meaning it's not saying this is, if you do this, you will be secure. What it's saying is over time, we want you to see a maturity curve that looks like the following. And frankly, if you're an organization that is either small, not a big supplier, not holding huge amounts of critical unclassified information or classified critical unclassified information, CUI, you may not have to be at a level 5 in the maturity. There may only be a level 2 or 3 required. So I don't think it's better. I think it's just a different aspiration or goal that CMMC has versus the 800 approach. Similar, is it better than NIST was another question that came in. Another question was, is CMMC applicable to OT? Short answer is yes. If there is CUI on the OT side of your networks, it's applicable. And so it's about protecting that CUI. So for instance, if on a CNC machine, I have to take CUI and move it onto that machine, the design or something of that, and I can't find a way to pull out the CUI from that design, well, then that system now has CUI on it and I got to protect it. Now, if I can find a way to limit the amount of information that has to be moved into that CNC machine, great, terrific. I can hold that CUI on a server, segment it out from those other devices, and I can reduce my maturity requirements into OT. But as we know, that gets pretty tricky around drawing those lines and making sure that information doesn't move around. One of the questions was, how do you deal with systems or equipment that are out of date? The reality is that what CMMC allows for, or not just allows for, is designed for, is to say, look, there has to be processes and procedures and compensating controls. And so it may be that that system cannot be replaced. Okay, so what is your process? What is your security regime that you're going to use to ensure that CUI is protected if I can't patch that system or whatever? And so then documenting those controls that you have in place is important. I'm gonna, there's a few questions on here in the Q&A, so I'll try and address those. I've talked a bunch about the compliance standards. I'll come back. There's a question around C2M2. I'm happy to come back particularly on that one. I just want to hit on some of these others that aren't specifically compliant. So there's a question around, does the ICS protocol queries pull in details on the PLC backplane, such as slot numbers, PLC logic, when there's logic changes, et cetera. So what Verve pulls back specifically in this regard is we pull back the backplane in the sense of all the cards that are in the backplane, the firmware of those cards. We'll pull back the type of card, make model type of thing. We'll also be able to go through that card using things like SIP pathing to be able to get out the back end to see what else is connected in the back. We can pull back, you know, for instance, from protective relays, we can pull back configuration data from those. Questions, do we pull back all the ladder logic? We don't pull back ladder logic. However, we can integrate with tools that do that if somebody wants to do change management on those ladder logic. So we're basically detecting changes on firmware, cards, et cetera. And then if someone wants to go all the way down to the actual ladder logic, we'll use partner with tools where we can look at the ladder logic changes. Questions around, so a couple of these are on Verve specifically. So, you know, can we auto flag behavior that violates ICS protocol rules? Yes and no, we don't monitor the traffic for that. We'll monitor the HMIs for that. Probably a longer discussion about how we do that. Let me go off of the Verve questions for a minute to some of the more industry questions. Is a traditional SIM such as Splunk redundant? So let me just talk about SIMs in OT. So Splunk is a very, very effective tool and sending logs to that. And frankly, we integrate with Splunk to send our alerts, et cetera, to Splunk. We think there is value, whether it's us or someone else, we think there is value in having, I'll call it an OT SIM, as I'll call it a level 2 or tier 2 or whatever you want to call it, in alignment with your IT SOC. So there is no question, because IT and OT are coming together, we need to get those alerts and alarms, et cetera, into one place so that one group of analysts can see those behaviors. Absolutely believe that. However, when it comes to then trying to respond to an alert or some incident that's going on, we need to find a way to put in the hands of the OT team the data they need to do that incident response, and frankly, to build the OT specific rule sets that are necessary. We talk to customer after customer who has these fantastic rules for IT, and when you try and apply them to OT, they don't work well. And so what we find is having an OT SIM that runs with your Splunk instance or something is incredibly valuable to feed the right information into Splunk. So it saves some money on your Splunk thing since you're not sending every log, but then also from an incident response point of view, allows you to have real deep OT touch, so to speak, on that on the data for incident response. I think those are, the rest of the questions are very Verve specific, so I'll try and come back to those maybe in a separate conversation. I don't want to sort of absorb everybody's time just talking about Verve. But in short, I just want to end us here today. Look, CMMC is coming. For those of you in the defense industrial base, it is coming down the road. I don't think it's going to be here tomorrow, but certainly over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be really important. It is not, however, the end all and be all in the sense of what you want to be thinking of from cybersecurity, because it can limit your mind to just that CUI. And so what we wanted to do today was say, okay, look, here's what's in there, here's what's required, here's how to think about it. But let's take ourselves a step back and say, how do we want to secure these systems so we're not just focused on compliance with this particular standard, or sorry, maturity model, but that we are thinking about security more holistically, and how do we secure manufacturing environments, not just their information, but also their operation. So hopefully it was helpful today. We're really thrilled to have everybody join us, and as many questions as we have. Hopefully we've answered those, and we'll be sharing out the video as well as the slides after the session today. So again, thank you all for joining, and hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks so much.